The first thing I'm going to talk about is the story of Jim Cameron and the film Aliens, and how I talked to him about that script when he was writing it. I was a film student down at USC School of Cinema Television, which is now the USC School of Cinematic Arts, which most people just call it the USC Film School. Their logo, their trademark signature saying is "Reality ends here." And I'll tell you more about that later. But I worked there between 1981 through, I think, the early part of 1986. I did my general education studies there. I volunteered to work on a bunch of films while I was working there. And I went and ended up being a film projectionist there. That's where I learned to be a film projectionist, which was a stock and trade for me for many years. And that's the cat door. Calypso went outside. He loves it in this time of the evening where it's just after dusk. Eventually I became the assistant operations manager at the USC School of Cinema Television, and that was really lots of fun. But the year that James Cameron made Terminator, it was a big hit. A lot of people saw it, thought it was terrific, and they decided to go ahead and have a screening down at USC. I don't remember if this was in the summer or during the regular school semester, but we were all quite excited because Jim Cameron was going to come down and talk about his film. And I actually worked at Norris Cinema Theater, which is where they were having the screening. And I'd seen the film many times already because I was very impressed by it. And so I went up to the projection booth after the film started, and Jim Cameron was sitting up there. He was sitting in the manager's office. There was a sound booth which had no sound gear in it, so that was the ironic thing. And then there was the manager's office at the top of the stairs. And then there was a very big, huge sort of bridge, they called it, which was the big projection booth with all the projection gear. And then behind that was the assistant manager's office, and she was really the manager. And then behind that, I think they had a closet that they used for storing film prints and kind of dead space and stuff like that. But they had pretty impressive projection capabilities there. And so Jim Cameron was sitting up in the manager's office. The manager wasn't there, and he was reading a book that had been laying around that I had read. It was stories about old theater stories about like how Orson Welles was on stage one night doing Moby Dick, and his nose melted and fell off, and he drop kicked it across the stage, and kept going, much to the horror of the audience. And so I guess he didn't bring anything to read, and he had to sit there, and I guess he didn't want to watch his film for the 100 millionth time, although it was certainly, a great, fun movie. So I went up there, and I kind of interrupted him. I said, "Hey, do you mind if I talk to you for a minute?" And he said no. He's very, very gracious. And so I said, I just wanted to tell you how much I think Terminator is such a great movie, and, and how wonderful it was. And we talked for a little bit about a few things, and we talked about, I told him that I thought Michael Biehn was just terrific, that, that he played this John Connor character, and that, he had to say all these honestly kind of ridiculous lines that were like, "I'm here from the future to save you," and all that. And the whole story hinged on him being believable in that role, and he just had this veracity in his performance that really just made that film work, even though Schwarzenegger had kind of the flashier role, and Linda Hamilton had kind of the damsel in distress role who turns into the hard lady and stuff. But really, if you didn't believe the John Connor character, the film just didn't work. And I just told him what a great actor I thought Michael Biehn was, and how great his performance was in the film. And I guess he hadn't quite heard that before. I mean, I'm sure he knew that Michael Biehn was a good actor and all that, but so he kind of liked to hear that, so that was good. And then he mentioned to me that he was writing Aliens. And I remembered that I had read that in the trades, but that I'd kind of forgotten about it. So we talked about kind of around that for a little bit. And I told him that, a lot of people thought, Alien, was kind of like from Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers and, the Bug Wars and all that sort of a thing. And he knew Heinlein, of course, because, what science fiction fan doesn't know Robert Heinlein? I was actually lucky enough to meet him in my life, and I think on 3 or 4 separate occasions. And I'll tell you about that another time. But So then, Jim kind of said, well, I can't really tell you what, the film's about. I said, no, it's fine. You don't have to tell me what the film's about. I mean, I wouldn't ask you anyway because that's uncool because, they have to kind of get signed to a confidentiality agreement and they don't want any grief and they don't want it to show up in the press and all that. And then he kind of looked at me and, he said, what do you want to see in Aliens? And, I think by that time I had talked to him about, like, is there going to be power armor in Aliens? And he told me no. And, it wasn't really a Starship Troopers thing. And I was like, all right. Because I always thought that was the coolest thing about Starship Troopers, visually. But I told him, what I wanted to see in Aliens was, two things. I didn't want it to be the cat. And I wanted the corporation to get it. I think I said I wanted the company to get it. And he kind of said, what do you mean? And I said, well, in Alien, there's a scene where Sigourney Weaver, or Ripley, she goes to the lifeboat, and the alien's in the lifeboat, so she has to shut off the self-destruct. She's got Jonesy the cat in this little cat carrier, and she drops it. She runs to the front of the ship to the bridge to try and turn off the self-destruct, but she's too late. While she's doing all that, there's a shot where the alien comes along and looks at Jonesy the cat in the cat carrier. And the cat, I think, kind of hisses at the alien, And I said to him, Jim, if everybody's afraid there's an alien inside that cat, and if that cat explodes and an alien comes out of it, then all of these science fiction fans, especially the ladies who love cats and have like little paintings of cats with wings on their walls and cats on their t-shirts and things, are going to get up in the theater and tear down the screen and then burn the theater to the ground. So I said, oh, okay, whatever. And then he said, what's this thing about the company? And I said, well, in the first movie, Alien, there was this thing where the robot Ash, played by Ian Holm, it's revealed throughout the course of the story. At the beginning of the film, you think they run into this distress signal by accident. And then later, throughout the course of the film, it's told, rather obliquely, but it's very clear that they were sent there on that course, knowing that they would pick up this distress signal and that the robot Ash was sent with them, and that they were sent in harm's way without being told what was going on, and the robot Ash was supposed to bring a sample, back to Earth, which is why he left the facehugger onto John Hurt, who later exploded, and all that stuff. And I said, those corporate bastards who just care about money and power and war, and I just really want to see them get it. So, what's the point of me telling you this? Am I taking credit for this? No. Jim Cameron deserves all the credit for Aliens. He worked his ass off on that film, and he deserves all the credit. You might say that I might have suggested something about Ripley and the power armor, or that I might have suggested something about the scene with Ripley telling Jonesy the cat in Aliens, oh, you're staying behind this time where it's safe, or that, the character of Burke, might have been, inspired by our little conversation. But I don't know that's to be true, and it doesn't matter anyway. Jim could have written those pages before I met him. He could have been told by 5 other people to write those pages. He could have been told, that he had to do those pages against his will and he didn't want to do it at all, and the producers made him do it. You don't know what's going on. That's a wonderful film. And I later actually met Bill Paxton. I worked on The Dark Backward as an assistant editor. Sort of started as an apprentice editor. I ended up as an assistant editor on that show. I worked for my friend Peter Schenck, who was a wonderful man, and later edited Detroit Rock City, which was his dream in life because he was the biggest Kiss fan you could ever imagine, and he actually had a Kiss pinball machine that he had bought and had restored in his living room. He's just a wonderful guy and just one of those crazy people with great passion in life. And so when I met Bill Paxton, he was in Aliens and all that, so I was like, great. He has some of the best lines in that movie. And I guess what I want to say is that if I nudged even 1/1,000,000% to help make that film any better, that's fine. I also, waltz for free and work on science fiction conventions for free too. But that's the sort of thing that happens in Hollywood. You can meet pretty amazing people, and if you take the time to talk to them, miraculous things can occur. So that's the story of Jim Cameron, and that's the story of when I talked to him for the screening of... Oh, and by the way, why he was up in the projection booth while they were running Terminator, is he told me that when they had shot the optical soundtrack negative that they used to print the optical soundtrack positive information onto the release prints of the movie, when they did, I think it was reel 7, which would have been the beginning of reel 4, the double reel, the 2,000-foot reels. It was like 1AB is reel 1 and 2. They edit it in 1,000-foot rolls, and they put it together in 2,000-foot rolls for distribution. So they had shot it too quiet. For whatever reason, they didn't EQ it right, or the machine, or somebody bumped whatever happened. And it just never got fixed. And if you ever saw that film in a theater, there's a part of the film where it's a little quieter than it should be. So he was up there waiting for that reel to come up. And then he went over to the Dolby SR digital sound recorder and turned it from 7.0 up to, I think, 9. And then it played okay, and then he turned it back down to 7. And that's how dedicated he is, that he would care about a little screening for some film students down at USC. And he had called apparently all the theaters and told them to do it. And I don't know that the projectionists actually did it, but that happens. That happens in town. But it shows you that even the best people can have screw-ups happen to them, and it also shows you the best people care enough to try and make it right. I'll tell you one other story about Jim Cameron that actually is not directly about him. When I was at USC, of course I met Jim, and then after he had directed Titanic, and I knew Roger Barton, who was one of the editors on Titanic, and there's a whole story about that, but I don't know that I can actually tell that. But Kathy Bates came in, and she was working in a TV movie, and it was about the Leno-Letterman Wars, and I think she played Jay Leno's agent, and she came in, and she met me, and she was so nice to me and talked to me, and I was the director of post-production at Raleigh Studios in Hollywood at this time, and they were in room, I think, 630 up front, and they had a beautiful suite, and they were editing, and she came in to do some ADR, whatever it might have been. And so I met her, and she was so nice to me that I became completely starstruck. It's one of the few times in my life I've actually been starstruck, and I was sitting there looking at her, and, she was very nice about it all. But she was telling me about working on Titanic with Jim Cameron and how all the sets were so detailed, and the amazing sequences in the lifeboats and everything, and I couldn't even hear half of it because I was just standing there going, oh my God, it's Kathy Bates, and she was in Delores, Clairborne. When I was working, the editors for Delores, Clairborne were at Raleigh Studios. The film was shot in Nova Scotia, and they would ship the dailies in, and then they had to develop them, and then the editors would look at it, and it all get sunk up, and within a day or two of it being shot, they would be working on the sequences, and they'd be sending notes back and forth. And this is in the days of fax machines. And we had a thermal paper fax copier machine, a really old one. Raleigh was pretty cheap about getting new gear. I think they still are. I think they still have the original switchboard gear from like 1980. But I guess everybody has cell phones now, so what the hell. But the editors would send notes back and forth using our thermal fax copier, paper machine, our fax machine. And one day a roll came through, and it was the dumbest letter you ever read. And it was just somebody on a little rant going crazy about how dreadful it was to be in Nova Scotia working on this film because everything was going wrong. And I guess they had almost hit an extra with a car when they were doing the driving sequences in the city. And it was a very tough shoot. The weather was very hard. And they were, I think, the film is wonderful. And Kathy Bates in it is just wonderful. The cast is wonderful. It's one of my favorite movies ever and one of my favorite Stephen King novels. I haven't read all his novels, but the ones I've read, it's one of my favorites. But I guess things were difficult on that production, and I'll never forget the day that letter came through the thermal fax copy machine. But anyway, maybe that's why I got starstruck with Kathy Bates. Anyway, that's that story. So now I'm going to cut